Hello to everybody who has joined us so far. My name is Kevin Miller. I am the current fellow with the American Indian Law Program at the University of Colorado Law School. We are probably going to see quite a few more people come in the coming moments, but I just wanted to give a little bit of information to start. We really appreciate you joining us for this UN Permanent Forum preview. We will be recording so that we can share this with those who are unable to attend, so please keep that in mind. And we would like to ask that attendees remain on mute while the speakers are discussing their topics so that they can have their full time without interruption. We have set time aside for a Q&A toward the end of this meeting that will utilize the hand raise function in the message box, and that will be moderated by Kristen Carpenter of the University of Colorado Law School. We really hope you enjoy this preview event. And now I would like to welcome Kristen Carpenter to give opening remarks.
Thank you, Kevin. And I realize that folks are joining us from the waiting room. So welcome to everybody who is in the process of entering. Good day and welcome to this session entitled Permanent Forum Preview, Indigenous Peoples and Access to the United Nations. This is a webinar of the Implementation Project, a joint initiative of the Native American Rights Fund and the University of Colorado to advance advocacy and education concerning the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. As Kevin said, I'm Kristen Carpenter. I'm a professor at University of Colorado, and I direct the implementation project together with my colleague and friend Sue Noe at the Native American Rights Fund. And we founded this initiative in 2018 to help realize the aims of the UN Declaration in the United States. The Declaration is a powerful instrument. It recognizes the individual and collective rights of Indigenous peoples, their rights to exist as distinct societies, to culture, to land, to resources and language, to exercise self-determination, and the obligation of states like the United States to remedy past deprivations of those rights. The Declaration was adopted in 2007, and the United States expressed support for it in 2010. But for the Declaration to make a difference in the real lives of Indigenous peoples, it needs to be embraced through law reform, advocacy, and awareness. This is already happening in tribal communities, in national governments, and at the United Nations itself. And that brings us to today's session on the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. The Permanent Forum is one of 3 mechanisms at the United Nations devoted to Indigenous peoples' issues. And it has its annual meeting every spring, and it's coming up quickly, starting next Monday, April 25th, going through May 6th. And the forum during COVID years has transformed somewhat from a purely in-person meeting now to a hybrid meeting. And that potentially gives more folks the opportunity to access the events of the forum, whether in person or remotely. And so to provide some information about the forum, as well as the United Nations more broadly, we have a really amazing panel of speakers, and I'm going to introduce them briefly to you and then invite each of them to take the stage. We're going to have time, as Kevin said at the end, for questions and answers, which you can use the raise hand function, or that's probably the best. And we're having this as an interactive session, a meeting, not as a webinar, so that we can all see and hear each other. But of course, you're welcome to turn off the screen or on the screen as it suits you. I'd first like to introduce Jeffrey Roth. And Jeffrey Roth is currently vice chair and a member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And we're really lucky to have him today because he is actually about to be traveling to New York for the pre-session for the forum. He's an Indigenous nominated member of the forum from North America. He has a long history and distinguished background as a consultant to tribes in the areas of urban Indian health, as well as education and youth and urban issues. He previously served as an appointee of the Obama administration at Health and Human Services and the Indian Health Service, and he worked on implementation of the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act and the Affordable Care Act, and was involved in the day-to-day operations of IHS. When Mr. Roth takes the floor, we've asked him to talk a little bit about the particular agenda of this year's forum. What the topic will be, how Indigenous peoples can participate, and provide some maybe insider information to us in that respect. Next, we'll hear from Mrs. Carla General, who's Associate Legal Counsel for the Seneca Nation, where she works as in-house as a government attorney. And before working at the Seneca Nation, she was an attorney with the Indian Law Resource Center in Washington, DC. And I think many of us met her at that time, where she was actively involved in UN advocacy, helping to bring awareness of Indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination, to land and resources, and to combat some systemic injustice. She's a graduate of Syracuse University, where she has both her JD and MA, and she received her BA from St. Lawrence University. She's a citizen of the Mohawk Nation and was raised at Akwesasne. And then Honor Keeler is a citizen of Cherokee Nation. We're also very fortunate because she's serving as a consultant to the implementation project. And one of the things she'll discuss today, I think, is a draft guide to the United Nations for Indigenous peoples. And that will share a broader look at access to the UN, the permanent forum, but some of the other mechanisms as well. Ms. Keeler was a visiting assistant professor at Brown University, where she also graduated a number of years ago. Her JD is from the University of New Mexico. She's been deeply involved in sacred sites protection and repatriation work, both working with tribes and Indigenous organizations, as well as on the Federal Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Committee under the Secretary of Interior. Honor is the author of a really wonderful guide on repatriation from Routledge Press. And we're really fortunate to have her along with Mrs. General and Mr. Roth here today. So without any further comments from me, I will pass the baton to Mr. Roth. Each speaker will go for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll invite Q&A. I should say just briefly, thank you to the entire teams at the Native American Rights Fund and University of Colorado. We have an incredible group working on these substantive issues. Kevin is on the screen, but there are quite a few others behind the scenes, behind the screens, and we're grateful to each of you and to our audience for being with us here today. Jeff?
Great, thank you. Kristen, I appreciate it. And I'm actually excited to listen to as much as I can here today as well. I appreciate it. But as I told the panel earlier, I have a bag that I still need to pack and get on the road. So I will do that quick and a train to catch. So I want to thank NARF as well as University of Colorado for the opportunity to be here. And I really appreciate this preparation session. We have the organizational meeting of the permanent forum, which starts tomorrow morning, and where that typically takes place a couple months before the forum. But because of COVID and different things, we weren't able to do that organizational session. So we'll be doing it 2 days before the forum. So this Thursday and Friday. And in that meeting, we'll be getting updates on some UN initiatives, including the International Decade on Indigenous Languages and the Indigenous Food Systems Coalition. We'll also be agreeing on the election for the chair of the forum, the vice chairs of the forum, and the rapporteur for this coming forum. And then we're going to review the agenda session by session and discuss kind of preparations for getting the final report complete by the end of the second week. Boy, that report is a thing to get done in a short amount of time, and it's a lot of writing. And so we're late nights for everybody trying to get that all done. And so we want to make sure that we're prepared and ready to do it. And then on Monday, the 25th through May 6th, the 21st Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues will take place with the theme Indigenous Peoples, Business, Autonomy, and the Human Rights Principles of Due Diligence, including free, prior, and informed consent. And then, of course, at the end of the session, we'll adopt a final report with recommendations to UN agencies. So I wanted to give a heads up about some of the logistics. I know it's been a little bit of a confusing process with registration and information sharing. Most of what I'm going to cover is on the UN website. To get to the UN website, I use Google and I put PFII in Google, and it's the first response. So that's the easiest way to get there. And then for this session specifically, there's a tab, the 21st session tab, which has all of this information, a lot of this information under it. So unfortunately, registration has closed for the session so far this year. In-person space has been limited because of COVID. Organizations were only allowed to send 3 individuals per organization to attend this year. Most of the session of the Permanent Forum this year will take place in a hybrid format, in person and online for those who are registered. And all sessions are hybrid except the opening and closing session, which are going to be fully in-person sessions only. There will be a webcast, though, that doesn't require any registration. So in week 1 of the on UN Web TV, there'll be a webcast of the meetings with the exception of one closed meeting of the forum members on Wednesday morning. And in the second week, they're only going to be showing one meeting actually on Friday. Because none of the other ones will actually be covered by UN TV. So on Friday, May 6th, which is the only formal in-person meeting to take place, that's where we will adopt the reports and the agenda for the following year. Again, viewing the live stream will require registration. And that website is webtv.un.org. Is where you can see that. So the Permanent Forum website also has a lot of relevant documents and reports that are specific to this meeting. Under the document section online, I'd like to highlight the responses from most of the UN agencies. And these responses are meant to be to cover how they are working to implement the recommendations from previous Permanent Forum final reports, and how the agencies are achieving free, prior, and informed consent, and the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Also, how they are achieving consultation and partnerships with Indigenous communities. I think this is an extremely important part of the Permanent Forum. And that I think we need to start doing a better job of tracking the UN agency's responsiveness to Indigenous recommendations and to also the Permanent Forum recommendations. And this is really one of my priorities, to make sure we can have that accountability take place with the UN agencies. Each meeting session will take place and will last for 2 hours. And I know for people that have participated in the past, that seems very condensed in person. But if you are registered, there will be limited opportunities to make presentations or statements at this year's session. The sessions are shorter because of the hybrid nature of the meeting. Online UN meetings can only be 2 hours, twice a day for the interpreters. So typically there will be a morning session from 9 to 11 a.m. and an afternoon session from 3 to 5 p.m. We have been told that the virtual platform is much better this year than last year. I know it was a real pain last year, so I'm hoping that things are a lot easier to deal with this year. We'll see. If you have registered already, there is also a separate registration for speakers lists that is available on the website as well. So the deadline to sign up for the speakers lists for each of the sessions is 2 days before that session occurs. So on the agenda. So 2 days before, you need to sign up on the speakers lists. Now, the website states that there will be dialogues and discussions with observers in the agenda items indicated, and that the discussions are intended to be interactive in nature. And there will be no established list of speakers. In the meeting, if you want to speak, you press the button that's in front of you in the room. And if you're online, you raise your hand. So I have to say, I'm a little confused here. I don't quite understand all the logistics, because they are also allowing people to pre-register for the speakers list for those discussions that are supposed to be interactive. So my best guess would be to pre-register if you intend to speak, just to make sure. I think these lists are going to be long, especially trying to go back and forth between online and in person. And so the sooner, if you're going to be online, the sooner you can get registered, I think the better off you're going to be. With limited time, the interventions also need to be limited to 3 minutes each or shorter if there are many people that have requested to speak. And so whoever's facilitating each session will be making those decisions with the Secretariat. There's also a form and procedures on the website for Indigenous peoples, UN entities, NGOs, academia, and Indigenous peoples organizations to submit written statements to the forum. The form is a cover sheet for any written statement that you may want to submit. And we do get those during the forum and while we're writing our portions of the report. Regarding side events this year, there will be no in-person side events that take place. All side events will be online. So you do not have to be registered for the permanent forum to participate in the side events during this 21st session. As of yesterday, I just looked at the list, there are 62 events that have been scheduled to take place virtually during the 2-week session. I have to say that really surprises me. I'm very happy to see that. There's no deadline to submit side events, so the list will continue to be updated every second day during the forum. They posted yesterday, so I imagine they'll post again in 2 days. I want to take a minute and briefly go through the agenda itself as well. As for the forum agenda, on Monday, April 25th at 11 a.m., and Monday is the only day that the session does not start at 9 a.m. So on Monday at 11, the 25th, there will be the opening ceremony in the General Assembly Hall. We'll have speakers from the UN and other dignitaries. We will have our official election of the chair and the rest of the Bureau of the Permanent Forum, and then we'll adopt the agenda for this forum. In the afternoon on Monday from 3 to 5, there'll be a thematic dialogue on the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. There are 2 documents that will be references for that session specifically. The first is the International Decade of Indigenous Languages 2022-2023 Global Action Plan. And these are notes by the Secretariat on how this is going to be implemented. And then the second is a report from other members of the forum, specifically on the use of Indigenous languages in formal education systems in Latin America, South Africa, and Northern Eurasia. On Tuesday, the 26th, from 9 to 11, we'll begin conversations on the theme of the forum for this year that we talked about before, which is Indigenous people, business autonomy, and the human rights principles of due diligence, including free, prior, and informed consent. There's also 2 documents for that session. including Indigenous peoples and resource conflicts in the Sahel and the Congo Basin, and the rights of Indigenous people in relation to the global energy mix. Those are both written by members of the forum as well. In the afternoon on Tuesday, there's a continuation of that discussion on the theme. On Wednesday, there'll be a closed meeting that's not broadcast of the permanent forum members. And then in the afternoon, there's a human rights dialogue with the special rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples and the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous people. Thursday, the 28th from 9 to 11, we'll conclude the conversation on the human rights dialogue. And then we'll meet on what future work is being proposed for the permanent forum, including issues considered by the Economic and Social Council and emerging issues. So this is how we set the agenda for the following session. In the afternoon on the 28th, there'll be a discussion on the 6 mandated areas of the permanent forum. Those areas, again, are economic and social development, culture, environment, education, health, and human rights. And this is all within reference of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the outcomes document of the World Conference on Indigenous People and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. There's one report from a colleague entitled Collective Intellectual Property and the Appropriation of the Ideas and Creations of Indigenous People. On Friday the 29th from 9 to 11, there'll be a dialogue with Indigenous peoples. And in the afternoon, 3 to 5, there will be a continuation of the previous day's discussions on the 6 mandated areas of the permanent forum. So Monday, May 2nd, in my book, unfortunately, is a UN holiday. And so there'll be no meetings, and we're going to lose a day of the forum, unfortunately. So then back on Tuesday, the 3rd in the morning, we will be in a dialogue with the United Nations agencies, funds, and programs. Representatives from all the agencies will be in dialogue with us. This will not be broadcast on UN Web TV, but if you have registered, you should be able to log in and see it. There's one report document that will be in reference to this section, and it's from the Secretariat's office on a system-wide action plan for ensuring a coherent approach to achieving the end of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, implementation by the United Nations system. On Tuesday afternoon from 3 to 5, there'll be 2 regional dialogues. And the rest of the week, we basically go into regional dialogue. So on that Tuesday, 3 to 5, we actually have Central and South America and the Caribbean, and then North America, the North American dialogue. The North American dialogue is going to be exclusively online. And that's because there's some logistics issues and room issues and lack of interpreters. And so each day, because there's 2 sessions happening at the same time, one of us has to be exclusively online, and then the other one will have the interpreters. So North America will be virtual on in the afternoon. So please get the word out. I've been trying to let everybody know that we're online in the afternoon on the 3rd. I've invited national NGOs to speak there, as well as the Canadian government and the US government, and hope to have their participation. I've also invited the newest member of the forum for next year, Keith Harper, to give some remarks as well. On Wednesday, the 4th, there'll be a continuation of the dialogues. And in the morning, we have Africa and the Pacific, and in the afternoon, the Arctic. On Thursday, the 5th, there's also a continuation of the dialogues regionally, and in the morning, it'll be Central and Eastern Europe, the Russia Federation, Central Asia, and Transcaucasia, and also Asia virtually. And in the afternoon, from 3 to 5 p.m., there will be a dialogue with the member states that will not be on the UN Web TV, but it will, you should be able to log into it if you have registered for the forum. And then on Friday, our last day, the permanent forum members will have a closed meeting in the morning to finalize the report. And then in the afternoon, we will have 3 items, including a provisional agenda adoption for the 22nd session of the permanent forum, adoption of the final report for the 21st session, this current session of the permanent forum, and then also a closing session and remarks. So I hope that's helpful. I'm sorry, I know it took a while, but I hope that's helpful of going through and you know, I'm really focused this year on a few priorities that I'd kind of briefly like to go over if that's possible. You know, my first priority really is about the first Indigenous food systems and standing up the Indigenous Peoples Food Systems Coalition that was an outcome of the UN Food Systems Summit last year. My second priority is accountability globally for Indigenous people's health by the WHO. As we've seen from COVID nationally and globally, member states were not prepared to handle the intricacies of a response for our peoples globally. The global COVID-19 response is another priority and how it was achieved in our Indigenous communities. Additional work needs to be done on vaccinations and systemic issues resulting from the pandemic, in addition to free, prior, informed consent in relation to member states' responses in our communities. The fourth is representation of Indigenous people at the UN. You know, in everything that I've participated so far in the UN system, the outcomes and products globally would be more effective with more meaningful participation of Indigenous people. We need to continue to push on representation for Indigenous people. My fifth is HIV and AIDS in tribal and Indigenous communities. This pandemic has never been overcome yet, and we're seeing decreased investments in our communities globally as well, and that's another issue that I'm very concerned about. And then my last issue that I'm focused on is ensuring that the World Bank uses its global influence and development funding to implement fully the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the free, prior, informed consent in member states. We all know that funding is the key often to implementing change, and we need to work to harness all of the resources of the World Bank to support our Indigenous people globally. So hopefully we can make some progress in these areas and have some good recommendations in our final report. I'm looking forward to a productive forum, and I want to thank again University of Colorado and NARF and Kristen for inviting me. I appreciate your time. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jeff. I really appreciate your generosity of time and information, and for us to, you know, look at the agenda with your help through the eyes of a member of the forum, I think is really helpful for those who might be planning to make statements or even just watching along on UN TV, and also to understand your own priorities as a member of the forum. I think gives us some good insight as well. And thank you also for reminding us that there's going to be a chance for North American folks to get together, because I think maybe a number of people on this meeting might like to attend that event. And now I understand that it's going to be virtual, so we'll see each other again on the screen.
Can I add one thing to that?
Sure.
I just got confirmation before this that you don't have to be registered officially to get the link to be on the North American listing section. So if we can find a way to distribute that link, I mean, they want you to be registered, but I don't care. So if you can get the link, we can all be on that, even if you haven't been registered. So.
Well, that's great, because I think sometimes, and when I served on MRIP, those regional meetings could really help to bring things home. Like you're having this whole global conversation, but then to get together with the other Indigenous people and state representatives, if they're invited from your region, can be helpful. Do you know, sorry, one more question before I turn it to you, Carla. Do you know if anybody from Canada or the US will be invited, or are those purely Indigenous peoples regional meetings?
The regional meeting, yes, they have been invited. Yeah.
Okay.
And
We'll see.
yeah, I hope they're going to be doing introductory remarks, still finalizing
Okay.
stuff. So
Cross fingers. All right. Well, thank you again. And I will now pass the baton to Mrs. Carla, General. And whereas we asked Jeff to really focus on this year's session, we asked Carla, through her vast experience, perhaps to talk a little bit more broadly about why tribes might want to participate in the permanent forum, how they can make it productive for them to do so. And with that, I will pass it to you, Carla. Thank you.
Thank you. Sego so Glego Gaunios. That is how I introduce myself in my language. Good morning, good afternoon to folks on the line, and thank you to all the participants for being here. Thank you to Kristen, NARF, and University of Colorado Law School's implementation project for the invitation to speak. I am here today to talk about the importance of participating in the UN and the Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues from my personal experience and perspective and previous career experience. I have always had an interest in global governance and the role of international institutions in our lives. I guess you could say it's in my blood. My great-grandfather also had a great interest in international institutions, not by choice, but by necessity. When I was in high school, I learned of the adventures of my great-grandfather that he went on in his quest for justice for his people. I decided then that I would go to law school and seek justice for the human rights violations our people had suffered and are still suffering due to systemic issues related to colonization and dispossession. My talk today will share a bit of background information about Indigenous participation at the UN generally, including at the Permanent Forum, some of the reasons why it's so important to have Indigenous governments represented, as Jeff mentioned, meaningful participation, and then some recommendations moving forward. But first, we'll provide a little bit of background information. And we'll start in 1923. In 1923, my great-grandfather, Chief Diskahe, representing the Six Nations Haudenosaunee Confederacy, sought to address the League of Nations when it met in Geneva, Switzerland that year. At that time, Canada was committing human rights violations and attempting to enforce the Indian Act's provisions regarding governance upon the people of the Six Nations. If you've heard of the Indian Reorganization Act in the United States, the Indian Act in Canada had similar goals, namely control of government and assimilation. Rather than form a new government under the Indian Act, the Six Nations Haudenosaunee traditional government requested that Diskahe seek intervention from the international community. He traveled to London, Paris, Geneva, and other cities throughout Switzerland, spending more than a year trying to garner support for his mission. He won the support of 4 countries, including Persia, which requested his issue be placed on the League's agenda. And this was vetoed by more powerful countries like Great Britain, with the support of Canada. So while Diskahe never addressed the League, he did submit an appeal for justice to the Secretary General, requesting membership in the League and noting that the Haudenosaunee Confederacy is part of the oldest League of Nations, with a status recognized via treaty making by the governments of Great Britain, France, and the Netherlands, and their successor states, the US and Canada. Diskahe gained broad support from civil society, but he was never able to directly address the League himself. Canada was able to force elections upon the Six Nations to install a new government under the Indian Act after all, but the traditional government also remains to this day. Another example of early advocacy at the League was by a Maori leader who traveled to Geneva in 1925 to protest the breaking of the Treaty of Waitangi, and he was also denied access then. Since then, there have been other efforts to reach the international community. In 1977, delegations of Indigenous leaders again went to the United Nations to seek justice. That year, in 1977, the UN held a conference on discrimination against Indigenous populations in the Americas. At this time, the first draft declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples was presented for consideration. 30 years later, in 2007, the UN General Assembly would adopt a negotiated and consensus-based version of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The importance of the declaration cannot be overstated. As Kristen mentioned, there is now global consensus that Indigenous peoples exist and that our right to exist will be honored by the world. This includes the right to self-govern, self-determine, practice our culture and language, and to control our land and resources. It is an international affirmation of our rights. While 2007 presented a turning point in the recognition of our rights, 2022 presents many challenges in the implementation of our rights. Some of these challenges can be overcome by taking our place in the international community. However, there remain some procedural issues at the United Nations which restrict our place taking. And I am here today to talk a little bit about those challenges. Indigenous governments are among the first self-governing peoples in the world. The governance system of the Six Nations Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which is the Great Law of Peace, is credited with inspiring the US Constitution, as it was the most democratic system of its time. Yet the Haudenosaunee and all other Indigenous governments are still unable to access the United Nations. The United Nations was not designed with Indigenous peoples' participation in mind. While individuals, groups, and NGOs have had some success, Indigenous governments are not presently recognized by the United Nations system in any formal sense, and are therefore unable to participate in their own right in important meetings and activities affecting them. Indigenous individuals and groups, as voluntary constituted non-governmental or civil society organizations, have well-established accreditation mechanisms to participate in the work of the UN. However, no existing process or accreditation mechanism recognizes the distinct spiritual, political, social, and legal nature of Indigenous governments. Without a special invitation, Indigenous governments cannot even attend or observe sessions of the Human Rights Council or the Third Committee of the General Assembly, which adopts annual resolutions on the rights of Indigenous peoples. These are some of the most important resolutions affecting our rights and our access to the UN. Indigenous governments cannot presently participate in the Commission on the Status of Women or other functional commissions of the Economic and Social Council, which regularly consider matters affecting Indigenous peoples. In 2014, over 150 Indigenous governments came together to support changes to this outdated and restrictive system. So what has happened since 2014? In the outcome document of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples in 2014, nation states or countries made a commitment to consider ways to enable the participation of Indigenous peoples' representatives and institutions in meetings of relevant UN bodies on issues affecting them. In 2015, the General Assembly tasked the President of the General Assembly to conduct consultations with states and Indigenous governments and to prepare a compilation of their views. The President appointed 4 key advisors, 2 Indigenous and 2 from states. And in July of 2016, a compilation was produced. And additional consultations were held. There was a draft resolution in May of 2017, and it was looking very promising that Indigenous governments would soon take their proper place at the UN, including at the Permanent Forum, but a few powerful countries shut it down. After multiple revisions and negotiations, states reached an impasse on the question of what is called a no objection procedure, which is a mechanism that would allow a member state to secretly exclude an applicant from being credentialed to participate at the UN without reason. Because the process is secret, the no objection procedure would effectively shield the objecting country from political repercussions or public scrutiny. This was very disheartening. A few months later, the General Assembly kicked the can again and decided only to continue considering the issue of participation at its 75th session 4 years later. It also asked the Secretary General to produce another report on participation and to conduct informal interactive hearings during its over the course of 3 years. The Secretary General's report has since been issued, and 2 of the 3 hearings have taken place during the Permanent Forum on the Margins, one in 2018 and one in 2019. And the 3rd was canceled due to COVID. So since 2019, nothing has really happened. So the prospects are feeling quite grim for Indigenous governments taking their proper place at the UN. And now is the time to renew the call for a permanent place for Indigenous governments. The 21st session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues is a good place to start. Participants can make statements during the forum's discussion on the World Conference outcome document on Thursday, April 28th and Friday, April 29th, as Jeff mentioned, and also during the dialogue with member states on Thursday, May 5th. Participants can also arrange meetings directly with member states or their regional offices to share their views and encourage states to take renewed action. This is something in my previous work that we would essentially nag the member states, the representatives, to meet with us. There's the UN Blue Book that you can consult, which is basically an address book for all the permanent missions in New York. And you can reach out to them through that. Participants can arrange meetings with other Indigenous groups and other bodies of the UN to explain the need to enact meaningful participation. And then, as Kristen mentioned, just a reminder, the Permanent Forum, where it is situated in the UN system, I did print out the system map, which is always kind of mind-boggling in terms of the bureaucracy at play, but it is navigable, as Kristen mentioned. So the Permanent Forum is an advisory body within the Economic and Social Council, which is one of the largest functional councils of the UN. And the Permanent Forum will collect basically all of the information and issue its report with recommendations from the session to ECOSOC, the Economic Social Council. So I agree with Jeff that the recommendations need to be tracked along with much of the work as I was doing research. And I do remember being involved in 2017 and the participation front. And it was, I guess, 5 years have gone by. So it is a reminder that we need to be our own advocates and keep on the UN to actually do what it says it's going to do and keep these issues alive. So the Permanent Forum also is just one of 3 UN bodies that are specifically mandated to deal with Indigenous peoples' issues. The other 2 have mandates from another body, the Human Rights Council. So for me, this is some of the most important work to implement the UNDRIP. Without meaningful participation, there's no implementation of the UN Declaration. A new status for Indigenous governments will ensure their direct participation in activities of the UN in a manner in which they'll be able to make statements like member states do, to all the bodies of the UN impacting their rights, treaty bodies, treaties that their countries have signed on to, and to hold them accountable. Without Indigenous governments at the table, decisions made in international forums will not be responsive to the lived realities of Indigenous peoples at home. And we are our own best advocates to raise concerns about human rights violations, climate change, impacts to our sacred sites, and economic development, and violence against women and children. I also believe this is intergenerational work, so we have to involve the youth as they represent 40% of self-identified natives in the United States. So I'll turn now to just some of the opportunities ahead that I mentioned, making statements at the Permanent Forum, meeting with member states to explain how the UN Declaration needs to be upheld and implemented, and how meaningful participation needs to be provided at the UN, across the UN, not just the Permanent Forum. I think there's a ripe opportunity to, again, put pressure on the General Assembly. The third committee, which is the working committee of the General Assembly on Indigenous issues, that's just one of the issues they work on. They meet in September through December, and they already have a draft resolution on participation from previous years, as well as 2 Secretary General reports. So I think there's an opportunity there to highlight the issue again. The president of the General Assembly sets the agenda and he rotates. Right now it's the Maldives representative that's performing that's appointed to be the president. I believe this year will be someone from Eastern Europe that will be appointed in September. And then next year, Latin America, so it rotates around the regions. The other thing we can call on is for the implementation of the World Conference Article 8, which is requesting that our governments implement national action plans and gain the support of the US and Canada to make meaningful participation part of the action plan. And then also the NCAI resolution from October 2021, which calls on the US to develop the national action plan, appoint an ambassador for global Indigenous affairs, and support the full and effective participation of Indigenous governments at the UN. So these are just but a few things tribal governments and Indigenous peoples can advocate for today and at the Permanent Forum. Thank you for listening. Yauka.
Thank you, Carla. That was an amazing presentation, and I so much appreciate your perspective from intergenerational family experience and your own work at the UN, which I've seen in action and always been super impressed, and now your reflection on it. And I think, one of the things you've contributed to the conversation is to think about the procedure and institutions and structure of the UN, as well as the substantive points of advocacy. And thank you for mentioning that the Permanent Forum is an advisory body to ECOSOC, and that's the realm that we're engaging in here. And I think it is important for folks to know that while the Permanent Forum is important in its own right, and people can make statements, hopefully that states and other Indigenous peoples are listening to, and UN agencies, as Jeff said, another goal is to inform those recommendations from the forum to that resolution process that the third committee is involved in. And that's one of the goals, right, for the resolution from the third committee and then the whole General Assembly to adopt on Indigenous peoples' issues. And so many important things have come out of that process, most recently the declaration of the International Decade on Indigenous Languages, and hopefully eventually addressing the issue of participation, which is so critical. So thank you for mentioning all of that and doing so in such a beautiful way. In terms of meeting with states, and Sue, I might ask you to say something, sorry, off the cuff. I think we have the opportunity to meet with the US State Department, right? Isn't there a meeting that's scheduled in the margins?
Yes, there is an invitation that went out for a meeting, which let's see, maybe we can put that information in the chat.
Okay.
It was an invitation that we could share, and so love to put that in the chat and make that available.
That's great. And I think that, having a strong presence at that meeting, especially because sometimes we have a hard time getting the attention of the US State Department on Indigenous people's issues. So really having a strong presence there is critical. And then the more general part, that what's happening on the floor of the session is super important, but also all of these meetings in the margins where a lot of diplomacy happens. Carla, you've reminded me that we really need to take advantage and be present at those meetings too. And there's a lot of texting and making sure people are going to be there and so on. So let's all be ready for that. So thank you. I would now like to pass the floor to Ms. Honor Keeler, another of my close friends and colleagues. And Honor herself has, as I already said, a long history of advocacy and diplomacy at the United Nations, a presence at the Permanent Forum, and she's been working on this issue of Indigenous peoples and access to the UN even more broadly. And so Honor, I'd like to pass it to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you to the University of Colorado School of Law at Boulder, and to NARF and the Implementation Project, and to all of my fellow presenters today. It's been good listening to your insight here into the Permanent Forum and the functions at the UN that Indigenous peoples may participate in. I'd like to ask Kevin if he could switch off the screen share so that I can share my screen. Thank you, Kevin. Does everyone see the screen? Yes. I'm going to be going over a few things today, primarily having to do with ways in which Indigenous peoples can participate at the UN Permanent Forum. And I'll be going over a little bit about some issues that folks have brought up already. We have a forthcoming Indigenous Peoples Guide to the UN from the Implementation Project that will be coming out this year. So stay on the lookout for that. And we're very excited to have this released. It's meant to assist Indigenous peoples and Indigenous governments with navigating the UN system. In general, these chapters will go over many of the mechanisms and bodies in which Indigenous peoples may participate. Chapters will include the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which will be occurring later this year, the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, ways to participate on intellectual and cultural rights, and climate change. But today we're going to be focusing on the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. There are several important questions that are worth asking when looking at these different mechanisms and bodies that exist at the UN and how they might be utilized by Indigenous peoples. These questions include, where is this mechanism or body situated in the United Nations? What does its mandate or charter direct this mechanism to do? Meaning, what can they do to help your community? Who sits on the mechanism or body? What are important dates coming up throughout the year in which this mechanism or body meets so that Indigenous communities can plan ahead? How does one gain access, receive accreditation or register for these events? How do we as an Indigenous peoples make a statement or intervention, and what can be done with that? And who should we get to know? Carla, a moment ago, showed us this very chart of the United Nations system. As you can see, there are 6 main principal organs: the General Assembly, the Security Council, the Economic and Social Council, the Secretariat, the International Court of Justice, and the Trusteeship Council. And the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, as do several other mechanisms through which Indigenous peoples participate, exists under the Economic and Social Council. The other 2 entities that we won't be discussing as much today, but will be probably in future webinars, are the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, located under the Commission, the Human Rights Council, and General Assembly. Today, though, we're going to be focusing on the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and I'm not sure if you can see my cursor here, but it's in the blue section. And as you can see, that's located under other bodies. The Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues is mandated to cover several areas, including the economic and social development, culture, environment, education, health, and human rights. And it also takes into account cross-cutting areas. So for instance, Indigenous peoples and the 2030 Agenda, gender and Indigenous women, children and youth, and also acts upon data indicators. The Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues addresses provides expert advice and recommendation on Indigenous issues to the Council, as well as to programs, funds, and agencies of the UN through ECOSOC. It raises awareness and promotes the integration and coordination of activities related to Indigenous issues within the UN system. It provides and disseminates information on Indigenous issues and promotes respect for and full application of the provisions of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Who sits on the Permanent Forum? Well, you heard from Jeffrey Roth earlier today. And we're very glad to have him here in our presentation. But there are 16 experts that sit on the permanent forum. They serve 3-year terms, which can be reappointed or reelected once. There are government nominations, which have 8 members, and then they are elected by ECOSOC, and they're selected among 5 regions. Earlier today, you heard us reference the regions, and those are Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and Western Europe and other states. Indigenous peoples organizations also nominate 8 members, and they're appointed by the ECOSOC president and selected among 7 sociocultural regions, including Africa, Asia, Central and South America and the Caribbean, the Arctic, Central and Eastern Europe, the Russian Federation, Central Asia and Transcaucasia, North America, the Pacific, and there's a rotating seat among Africa, Asia, and Central and South America and the Caribbean. Important dates to keep in mind for the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. In January, we heard about several of them earlier today from Jeffrey Roth. But January, the Permanent Forum expert group meets to decide a study to be presented at the next session. March through April, usually registration and accreditation opens. It's closed for this year now, but many sessions are going to be webcast this year, which we heard earlier today. In April and May, usually the Permanent Forum occurs for 2 weeks in New York City. And the Permanent Forum also, one of their functions is to submit an annual report to ECOSOC. One of the, probably the most confounding in the beginning moments of Indigenous governments and Indigenous peoples is how to get access to the Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues. I remember years ago in my first meetings, which didn't have so much of the online abilities that we do today, that it became a question of, well, how does one get this accreditation? Accreditation and registration is open to non-governmental organizations, Indigenous peoples organizations, and academics. This registration and accreditation opens in March and April. It's usually available online now through the Civil Society Organization System, which is available on the Permanent Forum website. Indigenous peoples organizations and academics create a profile online, and once that accreditation is confirmed, they can register. NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and IPOs can also choose to seek consultative status through ECOSOC, which gives you greater capabilities. And Carla talked about that a little bit earlier. This consultative status is something that for years, as Carla discussed, Indigenous governments have been attempting to get at the UN. And she's talked about some ways in this Permanent Forum that issue may come forward among Indigenous governments. Another way for Indigenous peoples to participate throughout the Permanent Forum are through side events. And we heard this year the side events due to COVID are all going to be virtual. And I think we heard earlier that there was no deadline to submit, but these side events will be updated every second day. Usually when we didn't have online opportunities like we do now and outside of COVID, one would have to register with the UN body if you wanted to have a side event on site. It would have to be co-sponsored by a permanent or observer to the UN, and off premises. You wouldn't need that specific co-sponsorship there in New York. Planning for side events must happen months ahead of time to find locations and meet the deadlines usually that are in place with a permanent forum. So if any Indigenous governments or communities or Indigenous peoples would like to have a side event this year or next year, it's good to think ahead for these side events. The permanent forum is also important for networking. It's a great way to network with other Indigenous peoples organizations, NGOs, academics, governments, and UN reps. One of the most important things that Indigenous peoples can do during the permanent forum is to write a statement or an intervention, as they're often called. And usually these interventions are made on one or more agenda items. It's good to have them prepared or written out ahead of time, and to consider the permanent forum mandate. So what the permanent forum can do to help, and to make concrete recommendations. The interventions are generally a page to a page and a half. Usually you can sign up 2 days beforehand for the speakers list. However, as we heard earlier today, it's best to pre-register this year. In general, when you're there and present and making these interventions, you register with the secretariat, you tell them the agenda item where you wish to make a statement. And it's really important to register as soon as the speakers list opens. When you're there, it's also important to have a number of copies and to sit near a microphone and wait for your name to be called, and to put that microphone on. I know that in years past, some folks have struggled a little bit in getting that microphone on. There's a 3-minute time allowance or shorter for your intervention. And there are also opportunities to submit written statements, which we heard about earlier today. Throughout the permanent forum, it's also very important to continue to check the permanent forum website as it's constantly being updated. Who should we get to know? It's very important to get to know your 16 experts, and we were so lucky today to have Jeffrey Roth join us. So you've already gotten to know one of the people on the permanent forum on Indigenous issues, and it's also important to get to know, as Carla mentioned, folks in other governments, government representatives, and to get a hold of that the blue book there that provides some information on current representatives at the UN. And thank you all for allowing me to present today. My name is Honor Keeler, and you can reach me here at this email address. And I look forward also to taking any questions. Widow.
Thank you, Honor. That was wonderful. And for those of you who would like to know more, as Honor mentioned, she has put together a really wonderful draft guide to the United Nations geared towards Indigenous peoples. And so many of us who've navigated the struggles of registering every year, feel like we're reinventing the wheel every time. And our goal here is to develop some institutional and community knowledge so that we won't kind of be starting from scratch and figuring out registration and speakers list every single year. But it's tricky because, as we've all noticed, some of the processes have changed because of COVID. And for example, as I think Jeff mentioned, and Sue has reminded me, we need to also submit the statements to an email address that is provided on the speakers list. In addition to bringing the physical copies, and there, are a number of adjustments. Of course, everybody on this meeting, I think, is resilient, and some of this will navigate, in person when we're there, which is one of the reasons why Sue Noe and Kevin Miller and I will all be present in New York City, and probably scrolling back through Honor's Guide to remind ourselves of some of the rules and procedures to be effective at the forum. So this information, we really think of as an access to justice issue, and I'm grateful to Honor for advancing that in such an important way. I'd like at this point, and Honor, there's a question in the chat. If you would be willing to put your email address in the chat, that would be really great. And we'll ask you, and you can respond later, if you'd be willing to post your slides on our implementation project website, perhaps. Thank you for answering that. As promised, we will have a interactive Q&A session now, but before we turn to that, I wanted to ask my co-director, Sue Noe, Sue, if you'd like to make any comments at this time.
Sure. Thank you, Kristen. And hello, everyone. I'm Sue Noe. I'm a staff attorney with the Native American Rights Fund and co-director with Kristen of the implementation project. I want to thank all our speakers today for your wonderful presentations. I think the practical information and the background information that you provided has been really valuable, and very much appreciate that information, learning from you. I also want to acknowledge all the many Indigenous peoples in the US and around the world who worked for decades to achieve the adoption of the Declaration. And of course, emphasize the point that Carla made, the work of her great-grandfather, and then the intergenerational framework that we're in on these issues. This is something that, we're each doing our part. We're coming in the stream, and all decades of work has happened, and now is our time to do our part, and then also be thinking about the young people coming forward and how we can build their capacity as well to participate. I also wanted to comment on working strategically at the permanent forum. Of course, what we can do is participate, right? And as Carla pointed out, there's an issue about the status of our participation, but I'm wondering to what extent, so this is kind of a question that I'm opening up to our speakers. To what extent are there efforts to coordinate among people who are attending permanent forum on things like coordinating statements, so that multiple groups or multiple speakers are asking for recommendations from the forum? And does that strengthen the possibility of achieving those particular concrete, as folks were saying, to ask for concrete recommendations? So just wanted to open that up to learn about any coordination that might be happening. Thanks.
Thank you, Sue. And do any of the panelists want to take on that question, whether maybe Carla or Honor? I'll say what I know from the MRIP experience while people are gathering their thoughts, maybe. And Jeff, are you putting your camera on because you'd like to address that question? Okay, Jeff.
I'll do what I can.
Great.
Yes, I think it is very helpful in order to have multiple statements that are coordinated, at least when you're in the throes of getting the report together and wanting it to be included. I lost out on a lot of language last year that was frustrating. And so if there were more statements that had supported some of the things that we were trying to get included, I think it is helpful to be able to get that done. As far as coordination goes, I am trying to find a space to have a meeting in person for North America. I'm not having success. So if anybody's got a meeting room in New York, we have a time and a date that we'd like to do it, but I'm not finding anything within the UN yet. I'm gonna ask the US mission tomorrow if they can help out. But I think that's one space where there can be some coordination done. Other than that, I don't know, but I'm sure others know about coordination stuff that's happening.
Thank you, Jeff. That's super, super helpful. Carla and Honor, did you want to chime in?
I'll say a little.
Oh, go ahead, Carla.
I'll say a little bit about my previous work at the Indian Law Resource Center. We definitely tried to coordinate with other Indigenous. As a law firm, we represented mostly Indigenous governments. And so we tried to coordinate with them to sign on to any written statements that were submitted or any oral statements made. We would also try to get an elected leader to make the statement as often as possible so that the UN bodies could hear directly from those leaders. But I think in the interest of keeping the crazy bureaucracy organized, it does help to have consolidated statements. But I will say as Indigenous governments, I think they should all be able to speak freely as to their specific issues, which are not always going to be the same across the board. So I'm always an advocate for direct participation on behalf of individual Indigenous governments, but I do understand when it makes sense to coordinate. So a lot of my previous work was actually coordinating with the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples and having 3 minutes to represent the views of all people that had signed on to our statements, which oftentimes was could be a couple dozen or 150. And I think the Permanent Forum has a long history of prioritizing those regional caucus statements. I don't know if that's still the practice, but I don't know if Honor wants to say anything more about the Permanent Forum.
Thanks, Carla. Those are really important observations. I think, some of that also goes back toward Indigenous governments seeking consultative status and, how important that may be. I had mentioned earlier, regions, the UN system is typically to divide up places into regions. And it can be quite difficult, I think, sometimes, as Carla mentioned, when you have differing opinions, which is the case for many Indigenous communities and governments, to be able to come together. But, there are instances, where that happens. And I think it's really important also to see if you can get your statements together ahead of time. And be able to coordinate in that way, because the more often, I'm sure the experts hear statements made in front of them multiple times, the more often the better they'll be able to listen and hear it and include it in reports. I say it's good to have everything done ahead of time, but a lot of times at the Permanent Forum, you'll have a statement ready to go, and people, of course, will be talking to each other and will jump on to help out with the statement, or folks will stand behind them in support of statements being made. Sometimes on an agenda item, something comes up and you're scrambling the day before to make sure that you have coverage there. So while the ideal is to have everything ready ahead of time and coordinated, sometimes there are those last minute scrambles that everyone does because they're just hearing about each other's issues, and they want to make sure that they can be heard louder when they get to the UN Permanent Forum.
Those are all super helpful comments in response to Sue's really thoughtful question. Just to share a little bit from my experience having been on the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples, which meets in Geneva in July, not in New York, and April. Some of the most effective statements and the ones that we could really use did come from coalitions, but not necessarily. And I really would encourage, and I see there are representatives from Cherokee Nation and Shawnee Tribe. One of the things about these mechanisms, the expert mechanism, the permanent forum, is that while there are huge participation issues at the UN, you are free to speak as tribal governments at the permanent forum and at the expert mechanism. And so I don't want to diminish those participation issues, but please know that you absolutely can speak as the chief of the Shawnee tribe here or the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. And, those are important voices to bring. And some of the other elements that make the statements effective are absolutely to make sure you're on point with the agenda item. So if the agenda item is the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, you want to make sure that your statement is about that and not about something else that may be important to you. Because the chair, I don't know how severe they are at the permanent forum, but on MRIP, we would cut off people who were speaking on a different agenda item because there were 100 people who had signed up for that one. And also, when possible, to reference things like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So if you're speaking about the language issue, you might reference the obligation of states under Articles 13 and 14 of the Declaration, because one of your audiences is the US government, and you want this whole diplomatic process to lean on the United States to meet its obligations under that instrument. And then finally, I guess just one other thing I would recommend, in addition to writing it out, as everybody says, submitting it, practicing it, realizing it's going to be translated into 5 different languages. So providing it to the translators in advance can help concepts, be translated accurately into Russian and French and so on. But finally, amplify your own statements. I mean, you can post them on your own website. You can send them out on email. The International Indian Treaty Council is great at doing this, right? Not only issuing it at the moment, but also making sure that it gets some larger play, and maybe to your own tribal members, to others, so that they really have the chance to be invested. Now they can watch it on UN TV, so it's a little bit different, but taking care to put together that 3-minute statement is a lot of work. So you might as well, really amplify it. And I think all of those things will also help the permanent forum, or in MRIP's case, MRIP, to really use those statements effectively. I'm going on too long. Other questions, and if folks want to raise their hand or come on the screen or put a question in the chat, those are all fine, or comments are also fine. The presenters were so effective that they preempted any possible questions.
I'm sure everyone's just stunned with all the information that just came their way.
I know, it's a lot to digest. But every year we'll know a little bit more. While people are thinking about whether they may have questions, I guess I'll take this opportunity to say that, as I put in the chat, the implementation project will be there on the ground in New York, but we're also holding 2 virtual side events. And one of them is May 3rd from 1 to 2:30 Eastern. And the topic is implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in the US. And we have a really wonderful set of speakers for that side event. Sue Noe will be moderating it. And then our second side event will be May 5th from 1 to 2:30 Eastern. And that will be on language rights as human rights and the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. And both Chief Ben Barnes and Delegate Kim Teehee are invited to speak on that side event, and they've really been deeply involved in the already in the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, with Chief Barnes and Shawnee Tribe having declared a decade of the Shawnee language, and Kim Teehee, along with Chief Hoskin, having held the first launch event actually for the International Decade of Indigenous Languages in the United States. It was a really wonderful thing to have Cherokee Nation host that. One of the challenges, I guess, just to be candid, is that we're really hoping to have the United States and the Biden administration engage with us on implementing the declaration. And we have invited federal representatives to participate in our side events. They have not yet accepted, I think is the nicest way to put it. We hope that they will, because of course, implementing the declaration should be a collective effort between Indigenous peoples and state governments, and the UN Permanent Forum is really a chance to rally our efforts around that. So we invite you to attend our side events. We're grateful to the Indigenous leaders who will be speaking at them, and we remain hopeful that the United States will come to the table. I'm going to peek at the chat to see if there are questions or points there. Thank you, Kevin, for listing the side events. And Susan Anthony, it's good to see you, and thank you for your question there. Any other comments or questions? Since we're down to a smaller group, we can be informal if folks want to chime in. Okay, with that, I think we will end the session. We hope to see many of you in New York or on the screen at all of these different events. We're truly grateful. Chief Barnes, are you turning on your screen because you'd like to say something? No. Okay, I won't put you on the spot. All right. Well, everybody can have a few minutes of their day back to them, and we will see you all very soon. Take care, and thank you so much to the speakers, Jeff, Carla, and Honor. We're grateful. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Wadow.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank you.
everybody.